I am Leo Husakos, Member of Parliament in the Senate of Canada. I come to you today from our nation's capital of Ottawa, where I'm in my office on Parliament Hill, preparing for the start of Canada's 44th Parliament following our last federal election. That is why, unfortunately, I'm unable to be with you in person, although I am honored to support and be part of the strategy expressed in the Transatlantic Parliamentary Coalition for a Free Cuba Forum. I thank you for your invitation, and I thank you for this much-needed initiative. I also want to thank all of the freedom-loving Cuban Canadians for their activism and commitment. It was right here in my office a few months ago that I had the pleasure of meeting with a group of fierce and dedicated Cuban Canadians, and they expressed to me the urgent need for Canada to stand with the Cuban people in their peaceful struggle for democracy. My colleague, Member of Parliament Pierre Poilievre, and I had joined them for a rally here on Parliament Hill, and they later marched through the streets of Ottawa in solidarity with those brave protesters who had taken to the streets of Cuba on July 11. Those fearless Cubans were the protagonists of the largest peaceful, spontaneous, and pro-democratic demonstration of the last 6 decades. More than 186,000 Cubans in at least 45 cities across Cuba took to the streets shouting, we are not afraid, freedom, patria y vida, and raising their voices for the right to what they have been denied for more than 6 decades. Free elections, democracy, plurality, rule of law, inclusion. These are things that we as Canadians take for granted, as well as the freedom and protection under our laws to take to the streets, to speak in opposition and criticism of government action without fear of reprisal and imprisonment. Just as we take for granted our parliamentary system of democracy, as I mentioned, we just held a federal election to select the people who will gather right here in a couple of days to take their seats in Parliament, to give voice to the people they represent, to give voice to all Canadians in holding their government to account. That's something the people of Cuba have not had since 1948, almost 75 years. Instead, the voices of peaceful demonstrators have been silenced with actions of repudiation, beatings, and defamation, dating back to the very beginnings of the current regime, when in 1960, democratic university students peacefully demonstrated in Havana, opposing the authoritarian direction of the then Cuban Revolution, the postponement of free elections, and the change of course towards a totalitarian system like that of the then Soviet Union. Their response to these demands was not consensus or debate, but mass arrests, expulsions from the university, and imprisonment. This denial of rights has continued for more than 6 decades in Cuba, and during this time, at least 500,000 Cubans have been arrested and imprisoned for political reasons in the beautiful island of Cuba. That's why events and organizations like yours are so important and so meaningful. It is long past due for the Cuban people to be heard, to have a say in their destiny, to have a say in the future of their children. Until they do, it is up to the rest of us, those of us who aren't subject to this brutal regime, to speak out for those whose voices are being silenced. And I will do exactly that. As a parliamentarian and as a Canadian who believes in defending the fundamental rights of freedom and democracy around the world, and has heard the voices of the Canadian-Cuban community advocating for Cuba's freedom, I support their calls to the Government of Canada in petition E3573 for the release of detainees and prisoners of conscience, for sanctions on high officials in Cuba responsible for serious human rights violations, for holding of free and democratic elections in the island, and Canada's recognition of the pro-democratic organization in Cuba. I express my solidarity with the Cuban people in their just and dignified pursuit to live freely and peacefully. I will continue to raise awareness among Canadians about how tourism to Cuba and investment in Cuba contribute to the strengthening of the Cuban military and repressive apparatus. I will continue to raise my voice to encourage other members of Canada's Parliament to raise theirs in calling for the release of political prisoners and to condemn the repression against peaceful demonstrators and the absence of freedoms in Cuba. And together, our voices will grow stronger and louder. Canada is a nation founded on freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. We defend those principles here at home and abroad, just as Canada has raised its voice against individuals and entities in more than 22 authoritarian regimes around the world responsible for gross human rights violations. We must do the same with the Cuban regime, which has been the longest lasting dictatorship in Latin American history. Unfortunately, our current government's relative silence on what's happening in Cuba is deafening. It is no secret that the Trudeau family has a long legacy with the communist regime in Cuba, rooted in the friendship between Pierre Trudeau and Fidel Castro. But the elders of the Castro regime have passed on, and so too should their legacy of tyranny and oppression. This is a pivotal time for the beautiful island nation of Cuba, and it is a time for Prime Minister Trudeau to forge his own legacy out of the shadow of his fathers. It is a time for Mr. Trudeau to forge a legacy not with the rulers, but with the people of Cuba. And so I call on the Trudeau government to stand on the right side of history, to listen to the voices of the Cuban people calling for democracy, and to join the international community in denouncing through actionable language and resolutions against those responsible for serious human rights violations, repression, and the politically motivated imprisonment of more than 1,130 Cubans just in the last 3 months. The Cuban regime has declared war on a new generation that demands democratic change. 326 of the more than 500 people imprisoned in Cuba are between the ages of 14 and 30. Among them is Michael Carey Abedin, a 19-year-old dual Cuban-Canadian citizen who is not in good health and has been denied a doctor's visit and medical tests. Canada must call for his immediate release, along with the release of José Daniel Ferrer Garcia, Felix Navarro Rodriguez, Luis Manuel Otero Mecal Osorbo, Esteban Rodriguez, and all those detained and imprisoned for exercising their right to free speech and association. If Canadian foreign policy genuinely supports a future for Cuba that fully embraces the fundamental values of freedom and democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, then it is the time to assert that principle and to side with the people of Cuba with dynamism at a time when a new generation demands to live in a free and democratic nation. Patria, vida y libertad. God bless Cuba. Thank you so much.